firstly, I want to just talk about some principles. So I think, the biggest one of the biggest challenges with LiveOps is, making sure that you can build a process which you can sustain. So your team can sustain and not burn out. You're not on a sort of content treadmill where you're constantly fighting to keep up with what you need to create, and that obviously you're ready to scale when hopefully your game releases and grows and actually has the scope to really scale up. So whilst obviously at the beginning things can be quite small, you can technically do things a bit more ad hoc. Actually what you really need to do is get into a solid process so that you're ready when you're ready to scale up. So some of the sort of 5 principles that we live by, and I think our team and developers who work with are probably sick of hearing me say this, but firstly, planning ahead. And by planning ahead, I don't mean planning for next week. I mean planning for next month, the next 6 months, the next 3 months, really looking ahead and making sure that you've got plans in place, because things take time. If you have to develop features, you have to develop content, and you have to know what's going on and make sure that you're ready to sort of move forward. So planning ahead significantly is key. Working in a structured way is really important. So it's very tempting to be very reactive, particularly in the early days when things are quite iterative, and that obviously is very important. But equally, actually having a structured process that you can really follow and keeping to it unless you have reason not to is really important. And actually, you should have a structure for making changes so that you can support those. A predictable cadence of activity. So this is what we talk about in terms of community. So it's very tempting to think that more is more, and that actually what a community needs is more stuff, more. Actually, the most single important thing is that it's a predictable cadence of activity, so that you tell them what you're going to do and when you're going to do it, and then you do it. And you do that repeatedly and regularly so that there's a routine. And it's much better to underpromise and to have that and to be able to keep that going than overpromise and not be able to deliver. We all have that. It happens to everybody, right? Every game, there's something you say you're going to do and you can't do it. That's life. But trying to plan for that not to happen and trying to plan to have a predictable cadence is really important. And then data-driven decision making. So I preach about this a lot, but obviously with a LiveOps game, the benefit of a game is that it's driven by the community, and therefore you should be designing a game for community. When I'm talking to new developers, or somebody with a new game, and they ask, what is it a publisher wants to see? The answer is somebody other than you thinks your game is good, right? And that applies here as well. So, whenever you're making decisions, you should be using the community and the people playing your game to inform that. That does not mean that what people talk about on Discord and the few that shout the loudest are the ones listen to. It's actually more that you need to take a variety of data and use that to analyze it. So game analytic data, sentiment analysis, attribution data, all those different things need to drive it. Now, data has to be interpreted, and actually one of the key things is how you actually interpret that data. So having people in your team who not only can analyze the data, or using a third-party platform that can do that, but then actually working out what that actually means. And trying to put aside your biases to really understand the data itself and be driven by that. That's harder. It's much easier said than done for that, I find. And then continuous improvement. So, every game is different. Every team is different. It all evolves as the game grows or changes over time. So, you can put processes in place, but they're never going to be perfect. You're always going to find issues. And actually, having a process of continuous improvement for the lifetime of the game is critical. And I would say that's the case for any business, let alone a game, but particularly for a LiveOps game. Making sure that you're always saying, well, are we doing things the best way? Should we be doing things differently? What can we do to improve is really important. And having a culture where identifying problems is not a negative. Things going wrong is not a negative. If they go wrong twice the same way, then yes, fair enough. But ultimately, having a culture where you encourage people to propose solutions and to identify problems and to work together to solve them in good faith is really important. So we don't have a blame culture. We have essentially, what is it we can all do together to improve? I think, if those sort of principles, those are the principles of LiveOps that we run by. And I think, they've set us in pretty good stead to really try, and it defines all the ways that we do things and how we make decisions and how we how we set things up, basically. So what actually is in a LiveOps game? Well, hopefully most people know this, but this is how we break them down. So we talk about events, promotions, content, and features. So what are each of these? Well, events could be a tournament, a daily challenge, a weekly event, whatever else. Often seasonal based, so Christmas events, Halloween events, Easter events, whatever else it is. But ultimately, these are things that people engage with, that give them a reason to play and give them extra rewards and stuff like that. You're probably going to have a variety of things. You might have a daily challenge, you might have something weekly, you might then have a seasonal thing, and so on. Events effectively kind of sit across LiveOps. They kind of rule everything, right? Because ultimately this is what keeps people coming back and really optimizes what you can do. The good thing about events as well is it doesn't actually require dev work, right? Because an event should be using existing things in the game to create new reasons to play and to come back. And so actually basing your entire structure around events is really important. Then you've got promotions, so pretty obvious, discounts, bundles, specific rewards, etc., etc. Often linked to events, but generally things that you want to sell, whether it's linked to a Steam sale or whatever else, or just a holiday event, whatever else it is. Giving people promotions to encourage them to engage more. Then you've got content. So content does not just mean assets. If the easiest way to get into a content treadmill problem is to think that content just means game assets. Content means many things. It means progression, optimization, narrative, playing with other people, collecting things and so on. Obviously some of those require physical art assets, but not all do. And so really thinking about what content you can create that doesn't require just creating more art assets is really important, because this is how you create a sustainable game that you can have a lot of content in without burning out your team. And then you've got features, pretty obviously. This obviously requires coders, but this should be the only thing that requires programmers, because once they've set up the systems to be able to create events, promotions, and content, you shouldn't need developers. So all of those other things also shouldn't require builds, right? This requires a build. These are bigger pieces of work. And the idea being that you do these less often, but they're bigger things. So you might release a new feature every quarter. But ultimately these are quite big things that, new gameplay mode, new whatever else it is. You make a big deal about these, but you don't try and do them too often. In between, you've got events, promotions, and content updates that are ongoing on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. So what's actually involved in running a LiveOps game? I'm sure there's a lot of other things, but these are really the kind of key areas that we think you need to think about. So, and I'm going to talk in a bit more detail about each of these as I go through. So LiveOps planning, delivery of that activity inside and out of the game, delivery of those content and features. You've got release management, problem management, DevOps, and then QA and localization. So LiveOps planning. Okay, well, what you're looking at in terms of input, you need really, I believe, 4 things. One is data, as I talked about. So you need to make sure that when you're planning, you're basing it on data. So obviously, not only based on what features people like, but once you've run a couple of events, which event worked better? What did people like more? Which one made more money? Which one kept players in more? Do you know why? Why is it that event A worked better than event B? And then you need the design team, right? Because they need to say, okay, this event needs to have these parameters. We need these assets, whatever else. And you've also got operational considerations. So it's all very well saying you're going to release a feature every 3 months, but can your dev team actually deliver that? So really being realistic about what your current team can support is really important. And again, that comes back to the kind of making sure that you can sustain the game. But there's no point in kind of overdoing it and then not being able to deliver. And then post-mortem. So this kind of comes back to the continuous improvement, but we always need to do more post-mortems. We never do them enough. I don't think anybody ever does. But we do try our best. And ultimately, it's the best way to learn. And we do like a monthly reporting process where actually it kind of helps us as part of that to really look at, well, what's worked, what hasn't worked, what can we change next month. I know Oscar particularly loves pre-mortems, where we pretend everything's gone wrong and look at what could have gone wrong in advance. We've only done a couple of those because it takes a lot of time, but the more you can take time to really look at what's worked and what hasn't worked, you can then start to really improve and optimize as you go.
They're genuinely brilliant things to do, and there's stuff that I cannot tell you how much pain they prevent in the future if you manage to find time to do them.
Oscar, you managed 11 minutes without stepping in. Okay, so planning process. Okay, so you've got the input, right? You know the information, you've got the information in front of you, and what do you do with it? So there are multiple ways to do this. This is how we do it. So we break down into a 12-month roadmap, a 3-month schedule, and a 30-day plan. And the reason we do that is because you need to plan significantly ahead, as I talked about earlier, but equally, you can't do everything super far ahead, right? You have to be able to be agile, and you also have to just, keep things moving. So we tend to break it down. We have a 12-month roadmap. The primary thing, the reason we have this is so the development team can actually schedule their dev work, because those features take a long time. The art team can also schedule the assets they need to create for the content. Really what we tend to include is like the monthly theme. If there's a seasonal activity, what it is that we're going to be really talking about at a high level that month, and then the features and content that we're going to need for that. So it's very high level, but we have a 12-month roadmap. We would say that at minimum you need that 6 months in advance, ideally 12. Generally we find that when you're in first testing and then you get into early launch, doing 12 months is actually very difficult. Once you get into more of an established cadence, it's easier. And then you've got a 3-month schedule. So at this point, you're taking what's in the 12-month roadmap and you're looking at least 3 months ahead, and you're looking at the specific activities. So, okay, if our theme this month is Christmas, then what's our event going to be? What's our promotion going to be? What content and features, and how are we going to talk about them? So what key messaging do we need? What key marketing assets do we need? What user acquisition are we going to do? What marketing are we going to do? Is it a massive feature that we're going to release and therefore we're going to do a huge marketing push? Or is it just sort of business as usual and therefore we're going to focus on community and some paid UA? Then you want to drive down further into the 30-day plan. So from that 3-month schedule, we'll have said, we're going to need messaging about this. We're going to need to tell the community about this. We're going to need assets that cover this area. We won't have broken down exactly. In the 30-day plan, you're actually saying writing the messaging, creating the assets. And the key thing here that we try and instill with our dev teams, and this is a challenge, is that we don't put anything in the 30-day plan that we haven't already received and signed off. So if we cannot plan, so we're planning 30 days ahead, right? So at the beginning of December, we're actually planning, I think, until the end of January, for example, right? We're not putting anything in our January 30-day plan that we haven't already received and signed off, because actually it's too risky. We all know, and I've been a developer myself, with all the best will in the world, we can believe 100% we're going to deliver something and it might go wrong. Someone gets sick, we find a bug, a platform tool or a third-party tool has a bug in it. There's so many things. So to avoid risk as much as possible, we try not to actually put anything in the 30-day plan that we haven't already got, so we know 100% it can be ready. Now, again, when you're in testing early stages, that can be very difficult, and sometimes you will have to waive that, and sometimes you'll have to say, actually, okay, we will do it, and you need to recognize that that's a risk. But it needs to be an exception, not the rule, because otherwise you can get into a very dangerous process where you don't know what's coming, and you can really get on a back foot. So, from us, practically, we have 2 physical documents. We have a 12-month roadmap, which is like a pretty high-level table. We actually use, I think that's in Notion. And then we have a spreadsheet, which is effectively the 3-month schedule and 30-day plan. And so we fill out for 3 months ahead. So I think at the moment we've got until the end of March for the 3-month schedule. And then as we get into each month, we fill out more and more detail from there. And then we have a marketing document where we fill in the actual community messaging and stuff like that. So this sounds really obvious, but it's really not in practice. Keeping to plans, keeping to process, keeping to guidelines is really, really important. And, if you need to change those, it needs to be an exception, and you need to have a process to deal with that. So you will have to make exceptions, absolutely. Without fail, you will have to make exceptions, but they need to be treated as exceptions. And so, you know, if something has to be changed, it has to be raised, it has to be made sure that everybody's aware it's a change and so on. Because otherwise, if you don't keep to these things as the norm, then you're going to really struggle going forward. Yeah, and as I said, you know, you need to try as much as possible to be proactive instead of reactive, but sometimes you do need to change the plans. And the key really is separating like what is just business as usual from actual sort of changes. So business as usual would be, you know, that in a 3-month schedule you're planning high level, and when you get to the 30-day you might go, actually, do you know what, we need to refine this thing. Fine. But that's not the same as saying, actually, we got the theme for this month wrong and we need to change a huge amount of things, or maybe this feature isn't being delivered when we said it would be, and therefore we've actually got to change our entire messaging for the month. And making sure that you have a process that allows that business as usual iteration and doesn't turn that into a negative, because it's not, but actually recognises when things are changes and actually need recognising as such is really important. And ultimately, you know, you need to be able to triage those issues and act on them accordingly. So a typical example might be that you release something and you get bad feedback from the community, right? So you say, actually, we need to change this. Well, how, you know, the instinct as a developer and as, you know, game creator, you want to fix it immediately, right? And your instinct is to like just throw everything else out the window and work on that. Now, that might be justified if that issue has really caused such a big problem that you need to do it immediately. But there will be many more scenarios where actually you need to fix it, but it does not justify throwing everything else out the window, because the impact of doing that is worse than the impact of not fixing it. So it's really important to have a solid triaging process and to not panic, and to really make sure that you're assessing the whole picture of the impact of that change, because it's very tempting to just dive into things and to try and react, particularly, for example, if you get a bug and players are unhappy. Obviously you need to fix that as soon as possible, but you need to get it right. It's better to take a little bit more time and fix it properly and make sure that nothing else fails than try and fix it immediately. Don't fix that properly, then you've got other problems that come up and so on. It can cascade. So what I would say here is basically, I should have a Douglas Adams don't panic button on here. That's basically what this slide says. So to deliver these things, events, content, promotions, content and features. So what I'm trying to show here is the amount of stuff that dev team and is in code does not need to be involved in. So the things in purple, the events and promotions, dev team should be nowhere near these. When you build the game, they will build a back-end config. And that's up to the LiveOps team. They're not programmers. They don't need to be programmers. You've also got marketing assets and messaging in-game and to the community, right? So the configuration system should allow you to put messaging and assets into the game as you see fit via the config. Obviously, you also can communicate to the community itself out of game. Then you've got content. So you will need, obviously, create some assets created, but you do not need a new build. It's really important that you can release content without a new build. So really the only place that the actual code and programmers should be involved is in the features. And really this is how you make a sustainable game, because if your programmers are required for everything, A, it's costly, and B, it's inefficient. So you need to make sure that your systems are set up so that the relevant people can do their job effectively without needing code and stuff like that. And then you've got release management, which in my experience is one of the most painful things. Depends on the game and the complexity, but really having a solid release management process is just so important. And I think anyone who's been through this will understand that. But ultimately putting in place that process and making sure that it's really solid is really important. And you've got to think about, when you're releasing something, does it require a new build? Does it require a new config? Does it require assets via an asset server? I can't stress enough. Asset servers, again, coming back to not needing builds for content, absolutely critical. Storefront updates, community activity associated with it, and all the requirements of the different platforms. So, Steam not allowing you to do discounts 30 days after you do something else, and Epic having their requirements for submitting builds and their review processes, and all these different things. All the platforms have different requirements, and actually if you've got a game that's going out on multiple platforms, you need to make sure that you know and can coordinate everything across all of those. So building out those processes and linking it with your LiveOps planning is really important. So knowing that, when the game is ready, it's going to take X amount of time. You've got to do this on this platform, this on this platform. There's a lot of different variables there, and depending on the game and the platform and different platforms, that can go from a bit complex to very complicated. And actually having that mapped out is really important, particularly because you've got many different teams involved, and making sure that somebody is coordinating all of those and people know in advance what they are expected to do and when is really important. So problem management. So obviously we talked earlier about kind of not panicking, but actually problem management is obviously broader than that. So, broadly speaking, you've got issues being reported from your community. You're going to have hopefully some kind of ticketing system. We use Zoho, but there's lots of different others. You've got people reporting stuff on Discord, via tickets, via email, via Facebook, etc., etc. And ultimately, you need to be able to manage those. And you need to be able to set expectations. So 3 of the key things that I think you need to consider. One is having a service level agreement. Even if you're an internal team and you're self-publishing and it's just you guys, it's really important, because actually what a service level agreement says is, well, for me, 2 key things. One is how we triage. So what the triaging rules are. So how we say, is this a priority 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? And if we tag it as a P1, what does that mean? Well, it means that we need to respond to the community super quickly. And then we need to probably down tools on other things and get stuff fixed. But if it's a P3, we need to respond to the community quickly, but we may not down tools. We may actually say, yes, we need to put a team on this, but we don't need to drop everything else. So you will have those kind of defined things. And essentially what you're looking at is kind of target times for resolving matters. But the other thing a service level agreement will say is, how you liaise with the community, what working hours you have, do you provide 24-hour support, or is it just working hours? And all those sort of things that says, well, what level of service do we provide to our consumers? And that's really important for 2 things. One is that so your team knows and any stakeholders know, but also so you can communicate that to the community so they have an expectation of when you will respond and what they can expect from you. If you've got a publisher or anyone else involved as well, if there's external teams, then it becomes even more important. So triaging. So as I said, it's really, really important to triage everything and to have those kind of key defined things so that you don't panic and, deal with things differently than perhaps is optimal for the overall experience. And then escalation. So, as part of triaging is knowing when to escalate and understanding within your own team or within, whatever relationship you have with publishers or whoever else, when things get escalated, when is it required for the community team to escalate this to management, when, and so on, and also making sure that you have defined between, first line, second line, third line support, right? So first line support is your community managers. They're talking to the community, they're finding out what the issue is. They need to have a basic set of things that they can respond to. They need to know the current problems in the game so that they're not having to go to the dev team every time there's an issue that the dev team already knows about. We have like a cheat sheet that the dev team keeps up to date. So if something comes in, if something's reported, the community team can go, do we already know about this issue? Oh, yes, we do. Okay, what do I tell them? Or when do I escalate? And if it's not on there, then they will often escalate to what we call second line support, which might be someone in the dev team who knows a bit more. Ultimately, third line support is the dev team themselves, right? So if it gets to the point where you can't solve it, you then escalate to the dev team and they have to look at it. But the point is that not everything goes to the dev team. And you make sure that you're really optimizing that process and making it as efficient as possible. So DevOps, this is very much the sort of high level stuff. Obviously, I'm not a DevOps developer, so there's a lot more behind all this. But from the point of view of sort of product ownership and delivery, these are the things that I really care about. One is making sure we've got different server environments that are fit for purpose for different things, and I'll talk about what those are in a minute. Obviously, server stability, and then data capture. So as hopefully you're all aware, there's been a lot of restrictions and talk in governments about how to capture data, what you can store, how you store it, etc. It is really, really important that you are aware of that and that you capture it appropriately. I think Oscar and I did a webinar about this a while ago, but there is quite a lot of guidance out there. We did some consulting with the ICO about it. And, you know, effectively there are some sort of core things that you can do early on to really make sure that you're not likely to slip into problems. So for a key one being separate personal data from gameplay data. And secondly, only capture personal data if you really need it. There's probably a lot of games that do not actually need to capture personal data. And so generally, if you can avoid it, do. If you're not making games for kids, it's easier. There's obviously more things that you need to consider. And, you know, just make sure that you structure it in a good way. If you do it from the beginning, it's a lot easier than having to retrofit it. But if anybody wants to talk about that specifically more, Oscar is always happy to talk about it, I know. Okay, so again, so, you know, again, this is hopefully pretty 101 stuff, but builds and server environments. So, you know, we obviously need to have builds that can point at various server environments. Really important that you don't hard code, so you can change the build at a different server environment without having to remake the build. It should be obvious, but we found that this is a really common pitfall that just isn't always intuitive, I guess, until you've been there and seen the pain of not doing it. Obviously also having debug mode on builds, which can also let you switch between those servers. And some tips, you know, where possible, you need to be able to roll back the build and the server from live if something goes wrong. That is difficult, right? It's not easy, but, you know, without it, it's difficult. Ideally, even when you're releasing features, the config should be the one to say whether the feature is enabled in the build or not. Again, this is not easy, but if you set it up from the beginning, it's a bit easier. But the benefit of this is that you can release a build way before you actually want to release a feature. So for us, that's a huge benefit if you can get it set up. Obviously, assure a solid migration process between servers. Again, not always intuitive, particularly if you're building your own tools and stuff, but, you know, it can be quite complicated, but absolutely critical because you spend a lot of time, you know, testing on one server. You need to know that if you migrate it, it's going to be reliable on the next. And then obviously having systems to live monitor server problems as well. So this is just an example, right? Everyone does this differently, but this is how we ask developers to do it. Just because it works for us, and, you know, I'm not reinventing the wheel here, but you might have different specific requirements for you. But essentially, you know, we tend to have an environment that is for the dev team to just do their thing, build features, test them, blah, blah, blah. Then we have a separate server that's for QA testing the build. So when something is done, it goes onto this server, it's tested by the QA team completely separately. We then, and these are probably the most critical, the staging and live server. So live server obviously is the live game, but the most important here is staging, which is a mirror of the live environment where you can test the build and the config pre-live. You can do deployment testing, and then you migrate that from staging to live. And that's really the most important thing, that staging environment is used only for its purpose. And, you know, if you need other server environments, you create them separately. But having that kind of staging and live process is critical. Yeah, we always say, you know, if you can have a beta branch that for user testing and things like that is a really benefit as well. But, you know, there's a lot more different server environments you could have. For us, I think having these 4 is basically the minimum. To be able to do those 4 things separately is really important. So just to kind of try and bring all this together a little bit. So this is, again, roughly how we do things, right? So I just want to talk through like what the process should be step by step to release things. So to deliver an event or a promotion, right, you're going to design it according to your LiveOps planning. So in your LiveOps plan, your design team is going to have said, this is the configuration that you need to create, right? So they're going to do that design in the LiveOps planning. You're going to take that and put it into your config, right? And you're going to put it on staging environment first, and you're going to do that as early as possible, right? Hopefully your system's set up so you could put that config and test it 2 months before it's going to go live, 3 months. I mean, as early as possible, it makes me happy. And then you're going to be able to test it, right? So whatever build is on staging, at some point you're obviously going to have to test with the latest build, but, you know, you make sure that you test on staging that the configuration works within the game. Then you schedule release in advance. And then you deploy to live. So you could deploy to live 2 weeks before the event launches. Actually, in some cases, you could deploy to live much earlier. The point is that the more you can do this in advance, the easier your life is going to be. And then all you're doing on release day is actually making sure that everything has gone to plan. And you'll note here, there's no build update, there's no asset server update. It's purely a configuration thing and then releasing. So content, obviously you're again going to design according to your LiveOps planning. So in the LiveOps plan, it's going to say we need these new skins, we need these new assets, whatever else it is. You create those, then you upload them to asset server, again, test on staging, schedule the release in advance and deploy to live. So again, as much as possible, you're putting them in advance and just you're going to have them pre-scheduled to deploy. Again, no build, purely a sort of back-end process. To deliver features, obviously slightly different. So you need to design and develop the feature, test it on the QA environment, deploy to the platform, obviously unpublished, and to staging, test it on staging, then push to release and the live environment, and taking that from staging to live. And that obviously is the more complicated one, but the point being that it's only for features where you have to do that. Obviously, you're often going to have a day where you're releasing a feature, an event, a promotion, and content. So they're all going to have to kind of fit together, and obviously you need to make sure that that's all coordinated, again, which is why the release process is complicated. But the more that you can do all of this in advance, the easier it's going to be to do that. And that's it. Anyone got any questions?
So, yeah, I mean, there was a comment made by Diogo, which I think is a really important one to get across. The comment was basically one thing about triaging issues before reaching the dev teams. It's important that even if there is a triage, that there's proper reporting down to those dev teams. And he was saying many times he's seen where live publishing team has been hot fixing small reoccurring issues because it was easy to do without actually notifying, so it never got deployed at a root level. And my response to that is absolutely, this is why you need a good ticketing system. We use Zoho, and other people use Zendesk. There are various tools out there. But the key thing is that it's not just a case of actually reporting on, at least in my view, it's not just a case of reporting it. It's looking at the trends of those reports that have happened over time. Ella, do you have any kind of like thoughts on kind of that part of things?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of what you said, right? It's definitely having a transparent system, and also, being very clear, I would say, with the triaging system, but also what first line support has authority to do or not do, right? So, the parameters of which they are allowed to work is really important. And I think that's actually a really good example of that, because, there should be a question of, were those hot fixes, should they be allowed to do those hot fixes? Now, maybe the answer is yes, but the process, if that's the case, needs to be, well, yes, you can do them, but you have to report them.
Yeah.
So to me, it seems like a lack of solid process, to be honest, which I know is a bit of a cop-out's the answer, but actually, if that is a problem, then making sure that there is a way for that to be reported, and maybe it's an automated report, is,
And it's amazing how often it is the case where if that is the problem, process is the solution, is the answer. I mean, for me, one of the key things there, and we don't always get this right, is to make sure that there's a proper issue log, and extracting on a regular basis and reporting the issue. It's actually really difficult to get people to get in a habit, because issues don't happen on a consistent basis, to automatically know, oh, that is an issue, therefore that needs to be logged. And also, not just that it needs to be logged, you need to know what mitigation, what the impact, what the consequences, who signs it off, is it something you need to follow up, and all those sort of things. Does that make sense?
We have I mean, and I spend half my time saying, have you put that in the issue log? To Oscar as well as everyone else.
Mostly to me, because I'm terrible.
But no, you're right, and logging that as an issue, so you can, and also we have like a overall kind of business process thing that I talk about once a month with the team. So I do like a company presentation, and in there I talk about the overall business processes that we need to improve. So to me, if there was a inter-team challenge like that, that would probably go into my actual overall business process challenges that we then address at management level to work out how to actually put in place that process, I would say.
Yeah.
But I do think that a lot of it comes down to setting boundaries for what people's authority is.
I think that's a really important point. I mean, particularly one of the things we do a lot in looking at the SLA, so service level agreement. And so as a publisher, we have a service level agreement with the developer, but internally, if you are doing all of this internally, your live ops team have to have a service level agreement, I would argue, because it's about setting expectations of what can be delivered and when and how and by who.
It's between the teams, right? So,
Yeah.
community team with design, with product team, with marketing team, with dev team, there needs to be an agreement of who does what and at what point different people get involved.
And how firm you are with that is going to depend on the scale of the team, because sometimes it's all hands to the pump. But also, if you've got to think about um, what's going to happen if, say, for example, somebody gets run over by a bus, if somebody goes on holiday, somebody wins a lottery, whatever it might be, who fills the gaps, and how do they know what to do?
I will also say that the majority of the time where that stuff goes wrong is because people are trying to help.
Yeah.
Like, most of the time you've got people in every team who just want to do an amazing job and want to see the game succeed. And so when things like that go wrong, it's usually because there's not clear kind of boundaries, but they're trying to help.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest thing I see.
And I know we're kind of labouring this a bit point, but I think to your point, Alo, the thing about having checklists and wikis and clear constraints about what's permitted by certain people at a certain time sounds quite authoritarian. It's actually the opposite. It's actually liberating. So Jeff's got a question here. What does an MVP live ops look like for a micro team full of just devs? And we're not allowed to just say you have to have a live ops publisher.
So okay, I'm gonna be pedantic here, but what does MVP mean? Because I hate, like, it means, so if you're saying it's something ready to launch, I'm gonna assume that, right? What does it look like? That's a really good question. So I think the biggest, if you're a dev team, then you need to make sure that you've still got minimal processes in place, right? So the challenge, if you're all dev and obviously don't have those other areas, is that you don't put those other processes in place, and that everything leads from the dev team. And I think for me that's kind of the biggest risk, because actually what you need is it to be led from product, from marketing, and so on. So what does it look like? I mean, in terms of what the game should look like, it would be data driven, right? So I don't know if this is kind of where you're going with the question, but in terms of what I'd expect for an MVP, I'd expect good retention and good return on advertising spend. In terms of process, I'd expect a basic process to be set up so that you can run things in live, but you may not have got everything in place. So for example, some of the things I talked about is like, I really want these, so having flags to turn features on and off and stuff like that, that's a nice to have, but you're probably going to have a very basic version of the process in reality. But I would say focus on stability above all.
I think there's a couple of other things. So Jeff actually continues the question, but
I can't see the question,
no,
sorry.
that's fine. I'll explain. I'll explain it in a bit. But I just want to chuck in a couple of things there. So I think actually that you've got configuration on the server is a must. That you've got data analytics is a must. That you've got an asset server should be a must. Not because I'm being pedantic, but because the amount of work you're going to have to make your devs do by having to have assets put into a build is not to be underestimated.
Actually, and I think just to I think actually the most important thing is that you've got those processes in place, because if you're a small team, you cannot afford to be spending a week sorting out your release every time.
Absolutely.
Like, and being having to QA and deploy, over and over and over. Like, you need to know that what you're doing is going to work, and you need to have the basic processes in place. So you need to have solid server environments, even if you've only got, 4. You need to have an asset server. You need to make sure that you're planning ahead, because in a small team, you don't have time to plan last minute. Somebody's sick, you don't have a replacement. So I would say doing, and back to that original point of promise less. So I would say do as little as possible in the game to make it sustainable, but get your processes solid.
Yeah.
For that.
For me, minimum viable product has a really clear meaning. It has to be the smallest possible thing that can be self-sustaining, and that means it has to be strong enough as a consumer proposition, but it also can't be anything more than it needed to be strong enough to be a commercial proposition. And I think to the further point that Jeff makes is what should be in place before for marketing success to unlock full funding for full-scale multi-tier ops. I think it's kind of a bit of a kind of catch-22, an oxymoron kind of in there somewhere. It's almost that I would look at it as every delivery is a hypothesis, and you've got to show that you have demonstrated you have succeeded. You've delivered a success point that can give the confidence to the next round of players, investors, whatever else it might be. So, in some ways, it's almost a mistake to think of it as an MVP, and instead, I mean, almost. Obviously, that's all. It's important to have that at the back of your head, but it's more a case of what's the proof point that's going to unlock the next amount of cash.
Yeah, ultimately they're going to care about data, right? At each stage it's different data, but ultimately, until you have revenue data, you're, relying on them trusting that what the data you've got so far will deliver, which puts it in a higher risk. So, for certain types of funding, you just need revenue data or ROAS, right? You need to show that you're making some kind of profit at least.
Return on advertising spend, yeah.
Yeah, but before that, retention data, obviously. And then if you get past that, then they're going to want to know that you're ready to scale it. So they're going to want to know the systems are in place, the processes are in place, and so on.
And actually, I'd argue, I mean, let me know if you know, but in some ways, the opportunity you have as a team of devs is that getting the back end tech isn't your biggest problem. Often, it's understanding the audience and how to communicate. I don't mean that cliche that devs can't talk to players. That's obviously too silly. But the fact is that your strong point is going to be in getting the tech right. So you want to make the best advantage of that, and that's about if you can provide ways to make sure that you have more stability, more data, strong server deliverables, reducing your pain in the other organizational areas, you're going to be better off. Cool. So Diogo's got another comment here. One very common thing for very database-driven games is to have a web tool, GM tool, dev tool, whatever it might be. Web tool is what I'm used to. That allows for manipulation of most game data from live from the web server, either through queries or editing configs directly from there. That allows for balancing, event scheduling, planning, etc., etc. All completely correct. Now, there's an actual dilemma in this one, and I'd love to know what Ella thinks about this. In the current context, some of you may have seen my particular fallout with Unity of late. But there's a challenge historically in the back end platforms. There are lots of services out there. There's Loot Locker, there's PlayFab, there's there was GameSparks, but that's gone the wayside. That's technically AWS Game Services, but then the transition between the two wasn't backwards compatible. Unity bought Chili Connect, but they decided that the transition for that to the next stage will not be backwards compatible. So there's a lot of really big complications about how do you build back-end systems sustainably. Ella, do you have a particular view on what stance devs should take?
Right. I've always been, and I am still, an advocate of don't reinvent the wheel. And as an independent developer, don't spend money and time where someone can provide a solution for you. And I still think that's the case, but over the last few years, with as Oscar said, some of the frustrations we've seen with the back end platforms, we've been affected by those, and obviously with the Unity stuff, I've always understood why developers want to build their own stuff, but I still think that you have limited budget, and if you've got limited budget, you need to spend it on the things that you can't get elsewhere. But I think that potentially I would be considering that as a short-term solution, and if my game scaled, I would be considering then replacing that with my own tech when the budget, if and when it justified it.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I wouldn't be building my own tech unless, if I did it, that I could get additional value from it, and that could be doing something that another platform can't do, or doing something which provides a better user experience, and things like that.
I would also say, and I know this is easy to say and difficult to do, but the more you can build your game so that the way it interacts with the third-party platforms is more transferable to others.
Exactly that.
probably it is good, really.
And there are some great people out there. We're big fans of Code Wizards. Stuart Muckley and his bunch are amazing, and they do a lot of work with teams to transition them from one platform to the other. But it is a cost. So you're going to have to bear that in mind, that one of the risks you will have is that at some point you may need to transition your platform or build something.
And I would say, like, which, you know, I know Oscar put in his article, but which, by the way, you should read. Is, you know, platforms, you know, you're going to rely on those platforms significantly, right? And I really believe that you want to, as with any business relationship, you want to work with people you trust and people you like. And so if I were you, I would be looking to build personal relationships with people in the platforms you're going to use. Because I think not only can that help when there are customer service issues, but actually just in terms of building trust and understanding where you are. I think that for me, that's a big thing. And I would be looking for platforms where I felt that there was some trust there.
Yeah, and I think trust is the most important thing, and the reason that a lot of these things fail is not because of any intention on any individual inside an organization. It's that the processes of that organization are broken down. And, there are other circumstances. I'm going to write another article at some point about the general wider issue of the industry. But the bottom line for me is, Ella made the absolute point. If you think about third-party platforms like middleware, and you design your data structures so that you're mapping them to their systems, mapping them later will be less expensive.
Yeah. And I think, you know, with like data analytics platforms, like if you don't have a data analyst and you're not good at analyzing data, then I do think, you know, there are some really good platforms out there.
Yeah.
Again, you know, making sure that, you know, the way you capture your data is transferable as much as possible. You know, I think from what we've seen, you know, it's very difficult or expensive to get a platform that does it as well as somebody can for your specific game, like manually. But equally, you know, obviously, you know, using a third-party platform might be a requirement for me.
Yeah.
But for me, if I had to choose the first thing to do myself, it would be data analysis.
Yeah. Cool. I think that's us done questions. Diego made a comment specifically: taking any provider is a marriage. Be sure you have plenty of support and you do not have to do any impromptu migration to another tool because of the company changing their services. Unfortunately, I think it's there's a slightly broken set of relationships out there right now, and that's part of the state of the market that we're in. But it's just makes it more and more challenging, and unfortunately there is no current safe haven, so
Yeah.
we have to deal with that.
I think, you know, I remember what it was like before, you know, we could afford to use third-party game engines, and, you know, like, whilst it is problematic now, and third-party tools and stuff, you know, the risk, it does considerably lower the risk. So you've got to be prepared for the problems that could occur with it, but I can't really see us going back to a system where we don't use this, because it just, you know, the alternative is just not feasible, really.
And there are tools out there that aren't part of the main tools. I mean, Godot or Godot, depending on who you ask. You've got, Game Maker. You've got even Hero Labs. Hero Labs have got a tool out there. There are a bunch of folks out there with various tools. And like I say, for backends, we've been quite pleased with the stuff that folks like Loot Locker and MetaPlay are pulling together in terms of backend. We think there's a few things that they could do differently, but that's another subject for another time. Cool. I think that's it. Has anyone got any last minute questions? If not, I will take the opportunity to thank Ella for that, and hopefully you guys got the value out of that. And obviously, if you've got any further questions later, that's what the Discord is all about. Please feel free to ask and answer them, and we'll try and come back to you.
AMA about it on Friday afternoon as well.
Yeah, so if you're around Friday afternoon, we'll be around to have a chat about it and do an AMA. Cool. Thank you very much, folks.
Thanks all. Bye. Bye.